Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 20 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat. So glad to see you all. Thanks for joining us. This is our weekly show from mxdwn.com, that's Mixtown, and we're going to recap some headlines and get into a little story. We're very late this week. We're very sorry for that. Lots of stuff going on, so we're going to try to zoom right through this. We're going to start in the world of movies with the Oscars. The Oscars had their annual telecast and gave away their awards, and this follows a pretty heinous year in which last year where Chris Rock made a joke about Jada Pinkett that Will Smith found objectionable and rushed the stage and slapped him in the face, cursed on live air, and somehow still won the Best Actor award and wasn't arrested nor charged with any crime. Subsequently, not stripped of his awards and banned from the Oscars for 10 years. So Jimmy Kimmel had the unenviable task of having to host the show following an event like that and made numerous jokes about various people protecting him, various fictional characters played by the famous actors in attendance that would protect him, and also how things like that will not happen again at the Oscars. And ultimately, in true Jimmy Kimmel fashion, did a really great job just being funny and making a lot of great jokes and not shying away from talking about some of the more difficult and complicated things going on and also what happened last year at the Oscars. Most significantly, and probably to everyone's happiness, Everything Everywhere All at Once pretty much, I don't want to say swept, but it won most of the major categories that really matter when it comes down to it. 3 of the 4 major acting categories, and then also Best Director, Best Editing, Best Original Screenplay, and Best Picture. And then most importantly, Best Supporting Actress for Jamie Lee Curtis, her first ever win for any Oscar. Best Supporting Actor in Ke Huy Quan, who some people might remember from all the way back in the 80s in Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. And of course, also the Goonies, and not a lot in between, unfortunately, and very beloved for his part in this particular movie. And then long overdue Michelle Yeoh for Best Actress. Similarly, there was also Brendan Fraser winning Best Actor for The Whale, and ostensibly, like everyone else I just mentioned, gave a really moving and sweet and touching speech. And a lot of people in general, probably reflective of the chaos of the last few years and everything that's been going on, had very moving and kind of poignant things to say, and including John Travolta, who came out to introduce the In Memoriam segment, which, Lenny Kravitz was the one performing behind, but, John Travolta lost his wife 3 years ago in 2020 to cancer very privately, Kelly Preston, and you could tell as he was giving the introduction for the In Memoriam segment, totally still devastated the loss of his wife. And of course, who wouldn't be, right? Like, how do you ever get over such a thing? And so much of the show spoke to that poignancy. And for what it's worth, for a 3.5 hour plus long telecast of people giving speeches and accepting awards and fancy dresses and suits and whatnot, it was a decently entertaining show, which is great and goes to all the people involved to try to put something like that together. We talked to you a little bit last week about how in Tennessee there is a new controversial law that is being affectionately referred to as the drag ban, which means that effectively people aren't allowed to give drag shows, drag performances, perform in drag in anything that's a public space, and especially in front of any children in any capacity, and effectively has criminal penalties that align with it depending on the frequency of the offense. And what is, of course, super dubious and not really known about it is exactly what qualifies as a drag show. And there's a lot of really, heinous conduct, but in that there's effectively going to be protests and protest concerts and also fundraisers in the wake of all of this to basically, try to raise awareness and press back against what it means. And, I kind of hinted that Bonnaroo had indicated they intended to have no changes in their performances, performers, or restrictions on their performers, and kind of drawing a line in the sand with Tennessee. There's been no comment from Tennessee's government or lawmakers about any of that. But the famed indie band Yola Tango, who, if you're not someone, I guess you could say, who's been listening to indie rock, college rock, alternative rock for more than 10 years, you might not be super familiar with Yola Tango, but people who came about from the 90s and the late 80s and the early original college rock and alternative rock kind of scenes, and of course have been following since the early 2000s. know Yola Tango is an excellent band that's been around for quite a while. Is kind of silently churning out great music, kind of like the Mountain Goats in that respect. Just not really someone who is like, Arctic Monkeys or, TV on the radio, as someone was like really tweaking out about, but like has always just kind of been a great band, quietly kicking butt and doing what they do. Well, they played a show in Nashville at a place called the Basement East. And after playing one set and then leaving the stage, they came back, and Ira Kaplan and James McNew, 2 of the band's members, were in drag. And basically, that was it. They didn't make any statements. They didn't issue any edicts. They just went out there, got up on stage, and effectively performed in drag. And then apparently were approached later for comment and said, quite simply, what we did last night couldn't have been clearer and requires no further comment. As I kind of indicated last week on the show, you're going to hear a lot about this, and this is going to become politically kind of the new big battleground, especially as more states start to try to enact draconian laws like this to try to challenge what is and isn't okay, what can and can't go to the Supreme Court. It's going to get very hairy. Make no mistake about it. Musicians across the musician world and the music biz and the touring landscape, especially international artists, have been trying to rally support to their fans to push back on the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Now, in January, the Department of Homeland Security had basically issued guidance that they had proposed, it hasn't happened yet, and I'm not even really clear exactly when it would happen or when it would go into effect, that they want to raise the cost of visas for performing artists who come to America. Now, it is a thing that not a lot of people talk about, that, of course, while there's certainly plenty of bands in America that can just get in the van and drive across the country and do shows, and that's certainly a thing. And in some of our earlier broadcasts late last year in 2022, we talked about how that's getting difficult, even just doing that because of the rising cost of gas and hotels and food and, inflation in general. But of course, a ton of the bands that people go to see live and are used to seeing live technically actually come from abroad, a lot of them from the UK, but also from all countries all over the world. And being able to get a visa has been, ever since the first days of Donald Trump's presidency, ever kind of more and more difficult. I've heard of festivals having people on their staff, on their payroll, that effectively their whole purpose is to essentially be like the guidance for bands that are coming from abroad and how to try to navigate the visa system so they can have their visas kind of squared away before it comes time to get on a plane to come to the show. And of course, still a lot of the time it doesn't come through, or the bands are a little lazy and things don't really work out. Well, ostensibly, bands across the touring landscape are trying to rally their fans against what DHS has proposed, because they're saying they want to make O1 visas rise from $460 to $1,655, and then P2 visas rise from $460 to $1,615. And that may not seem like a lot in a general sense, but it's a massive increase if you're a poor baby band. I mean, if you're, Adele, I'm sure you're fine. I'm sure it's not that big of a deal. I'm sure you can eat the cost of that. But for an average band or a band that's just trying to get going, it's a lot of money, especially if you don't have a lot of money for goods, services, food, travel, accommodations. It isn't like the old days where record labels would foot the entire bill for everything just to get a band over from somewhere. Elsewhere in the world of games, E3, which is known as the Electronic Entertainment Industry Expo. We've talked about it a bit before and other shows in the past, which used to be the bellwether of like conventions in the whole planet and like the shining star of the video game industry. Ostensibly, of course, massively disrupted by the pandemic, as any in-person event was, and it was kind of already having some problems in the run-up to the pandemic. So ostensibly E3 is a convention in the classic sense of things, where it would be this big open floor and people would show off their wares. But the really cool and exciting thing about it was, if you were a gamer or a video game fan, it was basically happening at the LA Convention Center in downtown Los Angeles, and almost every major game maker in the world would be there, and they'd have a booth and they'd set up and they'd usually demo. Either you could watch, or if not that, you could play portions of games that literally weren't going to come out for sometimes 2 years ahead of the event. And everyone was there and everything was there. It was just a ton of fun, really exciting. And, in the old days meant entirely for industry people. You weren't even really supposed to be there at E3 if you weren't a member of the gaming industry or the gaming media in some respects. So it was very hard to get into unless you were press, or if you had some legitimate affiliation reason to be a part of it. And effectively, it was a ball. Now, of course, what happened right before the pandemic came up, some of the major game companies basically started to decide, is this really worth the enormous expense that we're footing to it? I mean, at some level, they'd have to have games ready enough to be able to show something to try to show it off. And then another level, there was a cost of renting the space, the electricity, the staff, having people away from their jobs and all that kind of crap. And so companies like Sony and PlayStation were already backing out before the pandemic happened. Well, what's just been announced is that Microsoft, of course, Xbox, has said they will not be on the E3 show floor in any way this year. They were already kind of removed in previous years, having their own little thing kind of just outside the convention center, right across the way in that plaza down there. But effectively, they won't be on the floor at all. Instead, they're staging some kind of event of their own, undeclared exactly where or how it's going to happen on June 11th. Apparently, something about what they're doing will be a part of E3 Digital, which is E3's live stream. But now that means that if the gaming industry, this is their big thing, right? E3, Sony, PlayStation, Nintendo, and now Xbox, all not going to be present. So it certainly on some level opens up a lane for smaller companies and developers to go and try to prove themselves. I mean, if I was any other company in the world, Valve or Square Enix, I mean, I would be trying to have a major showing there, try to reach as many people as possible, but it also could have a chilling effect in that most gamers really want PlayStation and Xbox and Nintendo to be there. So moving on, our friends in Mixdown UK, which is our satellite publication and covers mostly UK, music news and things relevant to people in the United Kingdom, ostensibly have a story for us on Glastonbury 2023. Now, there was a ton of festivals announced this week. Everything is rip-roaring back. Everything for the summer is being announced, and all different kinds of festivals of all different kinds, shapes, and sizes, and some like even as far away as my home state in Connecticut. Don't know how a festival can happen in Connecticut with how bad the weather is, but hey, there it is. That gives you a sense of the market saturation of it all. And there's a ton of interesting, good bands in a lot of these lineups, but just for this week, rather than just me shouting band names at you in giant, unorganized lists for the next 20 minutes, I'm just going to focus on Glastonbury because it's kind of an interesting little piece of what's going on out there. Glastonbury, in some respects, is kind of like the granddaddy of them all and one of the earliest serious music festivals, and of course, the inspiration behind Coachella here in America, quite famously, and has long been just this big, giant party, 10 to 20 stages full of bands playing. A lot of times, some of the biggest bands don't even get announced, and they just show up. The festival routinely sells out long before any bands are even announced, which is beyond even what Coachella accomplishes, which usually it sells out very quickly in the week or so after they announce their lineup. This year's lineup, which is going to take place on June 21st through 25th at Worthy Farm, which is where it always takes place. And it's interesting to note, because it usually rains and it's muddy and all of that, a lot of the times they skip years. So they give a chance for the grass and the lawn and the garden there, well, not the garden, but the yard in general of the farm to recuperate so that people can come again. But this year, happening June 21st or 25th, includes too many damn bands to name, but we'll just give you a few of them: Arctic Monkeys, Guns N' Roses, Elton John, Lizzo, Goldfrapp, Alt J, Blondie, Carly Rae Jepsen, Christine and the Queens, Churches, Fatboy Slim, Fever Ray, Hot Chip, Khalees, Lana Del Rey, Left Field, Little Nas X, Maggie Rogers, Manic Street Preachers, Phoenix, Royal Blood, Slow Tie, Sparks, The War on Drugs, Thundercat, Tinarwen, Warpaint, Wise Blood, Cat Stevens. It's ridiculous. It's a big thing. It's a big expense, and it's a lot of commitment to do it, but the people who do it swear by it. Never been myself. Sure, it'll be a wonderful time. And then lastly, as just a little addendum before we move on to today's story and bring the show to a close, effectively, The Last of Us. We've been talking about this for about 9 weeks now, as The Last of Us, which is the HBO's big adaptation starring Pedro Pascal and Bella Ramsey, and basically recreating the story that Sony PlayStation gamers have known for the better part of 10 years, has basically become a bona fide hit. I mean, it kind of already was just from its premiere episode and doing 4.7 million viewers, but HBO very proudly announced at the beginning of the week, following Sunday's season finale, that the show had grown consistently in its audience all the way through the season and basically topped out at 8.2 million viewers for its finale last night. If you haven't seen it and you haven't watched it, and of course it seems like quite a lot of people have, really, at the end of the day, it's a fantastic show. It's breathtaking. It's devastating. It's beautiful. And now the television viewing world knows what video gamers have been obsessing about for years. The only difference being that in the video game, you control these characters and in some level have something even a little more invested in terms of their survival and what happens. Me personally, I think I have only the tiniest complaints about the show, and this isn't a spoiler for anybody who hasn't watched the show yet or plans to. The video game, there's definitely, I'm going to say there's more violence. There's obviously more violence, and violence isn't really what's necessary. But so much of the game kind of revolves around the ever-present threat of what is effectively their version of zombies, the cordyceps-infected humans, and effectively how much of a threat that is to existence at this state of humanity. And of course, the show has some of that, and there's certainly episodes where there is just how terrible the cordyceps-infected humans, or not zombies, or whatever you want to call them, are. But effectively, The show kind of minimizes it. It's ostensibly almost every moving piece of plot, everything about the story executed to perfection. It's gorgeous, it's haunting, it's terrifying, and it's a big, big question about, the human condition, the human soul. What do you stand for? What do you believe in? Where are your priorities? But some of that threat, of that ever-present threat of, on some level, ravagers or thieves, and then on the other level, of course, zombies of some respect, it's just not there. The further you go in the story, the less of a threat that feels like. And that takes a teeny bit of the edge off of it. But that's honestly my biggest complaint. Otherwise, if you haven't seen it, absolutely watch it. It's fantastic. So I'm going to end off today because usually, historically, this would be a week where someone like me would be at what's happening literally right now in Austin, Texas, which is called the South by Southwest Music Festival. Obviously, I'm not there. I'm here at home. I'm taping the show. I'm filming the show. I'm staging the show live. But for a long, long, long time, South by Southwest was like the heartbeat of my yearly existence. And for quite a lot of people, anyone who is adjacent to or connected to the music business, them too, to a lesser extent, the tech industry and the movie business. There's certainly been plenty of big movie premieres at South by Southwest over the years. But really, music, this was the thing the whole year was basically based around. So for the uninitiated, South by Southwest is kind of like a rock festival that doubles as a convention. It has all the standard things that a convention or an expo would have, right? It has a keynote address, sometimes multiple keynote addresses. It has panels and seminars. Excuse me. It has workshops. It also has, an expo floor where people set up and they expound on their companies. And South by Southwest, I believe, in some level, even had a whole poster convention called Flatstock that would happen as a part of the convention. But most prominently, and the reason why South by Southwest became such a big thing, is because staple to that. So it was kind of meant to be that the daytime was where the panels, the keynotes, the expo, the seminars, all your standard convention stuff was happening in the daytime. But then starting roughly 8 o'clock, after it was kind of a changeover in dinner time and everything, from 8 o'clock till 2 a.m., there would be what were called showcases. And then ostensibly the badge that you got from being a participant or a registry of South by Southwest became ostensibly your, one-stop, ticket to almost every concert venue in town. Austin is a pretty rad place in that it's a place you kind of like Philadelphia, you can kind of walk everywhere. You don't necessarily need a car to exist there. I mean, accommodations and where you stay was something that became as big as South by is a totally different, thing. But being there in the city, once you're there and you're in the action, you can walk to anything of 100 different concert venues, and they're all small with some minor exceptions of things that might be as big as Los Angeles is the Wiltern, but generally speaking, nothing that holds more than a few thousand people. Most of them small clubs that hold a couple hundred people. And ostensibly, you can just kind of wander from venue to venue to venue, experiencing things. And in some respect, it was meant to be hey, this is a cool idea many years ago when it started in the early 90s. And then it evolved very quickly to being the pulse of where exciting music was happening or being discovered in America. And so after a few things kind of in the early 2000s kind of hinted at that, not the least of which being, first Modest Yahoo, and not a lot of people remember Modest Yahoo right now. But then, of course, also not far after that, Arctic Monkeys, it became the place every band had to be. And then, of course, because every band was there, every fan would kind of migrate to the city to be a part of this atmosphere. Now, as it grew, as it became a bigger and bigger deal in America, more and more bands would show up, more and more of the services of the city would get clogged and congested. And then effectively, it became kind of a thing where it was just this writhing mass, hundreds of thousands of people running around. A lot of the times, just like this week, it would coincide with St. Patrick's Day. So that would bring rabble rousers and party people. Sometimes it would be unfortunate. And the timing would be, there'd be a football game at one of the local colleges outside of Austin and traffic would be even more congested. But then what happened as it grew, because not a lot of people really, when they're music people, even if they're A&R people or music supervisors, not a lot of people really care about panels and seminars and lectures. They just want to see bands. These people are trying to prospect who's going to be the next wave of musicians for tomorrow. Who is it they're going to manage if they're a manager? Who is it they want to try to sign or try to have their songs? Or do they just want to be in the know so they can feel like they can tell people hey, here's what's happening in the world of music. I know what's cool and what's exciting. Let me tell you what's cool and what's exciting. they wanted to have more shows. So then what happened is a whole subculture rose up around South by Southwest, and ostensibly what they commonly referred to as day parties. And day parties were essentially somebody, a magazine, a company, someone with more, time than money and cents would ostensibly find some kind of venue. A lot of the times, the same venues that the official South by Southwest showcases would happen at, and effectively they would basically stage an event for free. They'd get the bands already in town. They'd say, come play our show. And depending on how big their reputation or their stature is, most of these bands would play these shows for free. And the bands looked at it as kind of like an expense, right? Like a marketing expense. You would never hit more people and more tastemakers all in a row. So a lot of these bands weren't super worried about like getting real paid in order to be able to play these shows. So they'd play for free. And so you'd find all kinds of publications and things finding beer sponsors and marketing sponsorships and effectively having all these really, really great bands and these really great bills, and then just people everywhere going to see shows. So you'd have days where you'd go from noon till 6 o'clock at a day party, reset and have dinner, and then be at another show from, series of shows between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. And then in some of those early years, it didn't really last for super, super, super long. Into, as we came into the 2010s, it kind of started to filter up. But sometimes there'd be a lot of late night events where there'd be things that would start at 1:30 in the morning as a private party and then have like a bar going and dancing all the way till 5 in the morning. There was one year, and a lot of people who knew me in the music business or were friends of mine, kind of the joke about me was South by Southwest is going to go broke on Ray, because I would just run from one show to the other. I mean, it wasn't peacocking to me, right? Like a lot of people go to look hot, to get drunk, and to get high, party. Oh, I saw a cool band. Me, music was everything. So I wanted to see everything I possibly could. I wanted to know everything I possibly could. Yeah, I'd have a free beer here and there if there was one shoved in my face. But I mean, I wasn't really going to rage. I was just going to experience. And being able to cross off so many bands all in a row. And I mean, once it really got going, it got bananas. And it just became this incredible experience of stuff happening. So there was one year where basically I just kind of went crazy. And in the span of 3 days, I think I saw 53 bands, literally starting at noon or 1 o'clock probably each day. I'd be up late writing, and then I'd literally come back and just run and see more bands and go band, and just keep running and see bands. So, I mean, it was a thing to behold. I always remember that the first year that I went in 2006, I saw Kirk Kirkwood from the Meat Puppets do an amazing set. I saw Tina Dico from 07 do an amazing set. I saw Sia Furler when she wasn't wearing a mask or hiding behind her hair, and it was just the girl from Breathe Me at the end of 6 Feet Under, and then Hank Williams III doing an amazing set and headlining one night at one of the showcases that was there. And that pretty much changed my life. So fast forward a couple years, there was 1 year, all in a row, all in 1 week, as some of the major surprises that happened. There was one night where at the NPR showcase at Stubbs, the Decemberists came and did the entirety of The Hazards of Love with almost every special guest from that album with them on stage for the first time in front of audiences anywhere. It was breathtaking. The next night, DJ Shadow, Silver Sun Pickups, and Metallica played at the same venue, basically as a surprise, and ostensibly, it's kind of like it was like a corporate sponsorship tie-in for Guitar Hero. Guitar Hero, a lot of people might not remember Guitar Hero, which was like a game with like a fake button pressing guitar that people did as like a party game, and everyone would play on a PlayStation or an Xbox and simulate playing a song without actual instruments. And effectively, Metallica did an incredible set in like a 2,000 person space venue, and then the next night, Playboy, of all companies, had a late night party and the reunited Jane's Addiction, which was a new thing at that point, which is Eric Avery has often not been a part of Jane's Addiction. He is now again after all these years. But having had not been a part of it, the original 4 members of Stephen Perkins, Dave Navarro, Perry Farrell, and Eric Avery all together at the Playboy party. And then the next night, I didn't see it because it happened at the Perez Hilton party, and I was there for a minute and I left. But even Kanye West showed up. That was all in 1 week. So there's 1 year I remember, a different year, where I literally started at some party that Vice magazine was throwing. Vice used to do a lot of parties in South by Southwest in those days. And effectively, I started at noon, and the first things I saw were Boris and Napalm Death and Motorhead at some kind of metal party. And then I remember after going the whole night, show after show after show, I ended up at a late night party. Again, I think it might have been the Playboy party, if I remember correctly. And ostensibly, that event ended with Justice and Moby doing DJ sets all the way until 5 o'clock in the morning. So that was a straight 16 hours worth of shows, one after the other. I think I stopped twice for 20 minutes to get a piece of pizza or something like that. So it was really a thing of beauty to behold. Now, just like everything, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. Things change. And effectively, South by was always an amazing experience, right? And I think the event, and quite publicly so, was never really wild with how much people were coming to the city and not signing up to be a part of the festival. And all these free parties were kind of cannibalizing the business. And before you know it, a lot of people were finding the experience to be rough, not just because the cost of services, the cost of food or pedal bikes, everything had just gone up so much in the city since the earlier years when I went in 2006. But, the festival is a business at the end of the day. And effectively, all these free parties were bringing rabble-rousers who weren't really coming for the event. They weren't really music industry people, and they weren't really paying to be there. They weren't really supporting the infrastructure of the festival. Quite famously, one year, there was an accident where ostensibly a drunk driver ran through a police barricade. It was no fault of the festivals whatsoever, plowed into a crowd outside the Mohawk, and inadvertently killed a few people. And you could kind of feel like after that year, things just changed. Effectively, it was just a kind of a different vibe. A lot of bands started sitting out the festival. Some bands were saying they'd come, then they'd cancel. And then, of course, not far after that, the pandemic hit. And the whole, was it responsible to have a few 100,000 people in the same place sharing air when there was a highly communicable virus, on the loose? Obviously, the festival didn't happen for a couple of years, and it's now back. And so all the reports that I've been seeing kind of behind the glass and the stuff that publicists and other people send out to journalists and people like us, effectively there are events and there are parties and there are things going on. It doesn't sound like it's anywhere near as much as the glory days and when it was really, really going. But there was a time when the stuff that you could see there was just magic. It was such a wonderful thing. And I always equated it to being its own little rock and roll party town. It was just such an experience if you really, really love music, and to be able to see things in such kind of authentic spaces. And, my wife and I famously tell a story about how that first South by Southwest that I was at, there was a show that Isabel Campbell did, and it was on the back of the Ballad of the Broken Seas, the album she did with Mark Lanigan, who's recently, passed away. But at the time, she wasn't even touring with him. It was Eugene Kelly from the Vaselines that was backing her up in Mark Lanigan's position. And ostensibly, there were like 20 people in the room. Maybe it was great as Isabel Campbell was, and as much support as that record had. And nobody was there for that showcase. Who knows where they were? Might have been seeing Iggy and the Stooges or something that night. And effectively, somehow without knowing each other, my wife and I were in that room with 20 or 30 other people watching Isabel Campbell and didn't know each other and didn't meet for several years after that. So it's a small world after all. But what was possible, the things that you could do, the things you could see, I mean, I could probably stand here for the next 3 hours just telling stories about stuff that happened at that festival over the years. Seeing Duran Duran late night at a private party, seeing, probably a show that I thought was going to be shot, not because of any of the attendees, but the security, which was like the good music showcase that Kanye West did one year for Vivo at what they called the Vivo Power Station, where there was like 3.5 hours of just one amazing rapper after another, headlined by Kanye right after the My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy record. And then Jay-Z came out and finished the show with him. I mean, there was a show Damon Albarn did at the Fader Fort, which was this big corporate sponsored event that happened every year, where ostensibly, he played a whole bunch of soul material, but then ended with De La Soul doing the songs they did with him. But then also, for the first time ever, that Clint Eastwood was ever performed with Del the Funky Homo Sapien and Dan the Automator, and then Snoop Dogg came out on top of it. I mean, saw Amanda Palmer do a show with Billy Bragg that was incredible. Saw Tenacious D there numerous times. I mean, special things like Demolished Thoughts, which had Thurston Moore and Jay Mascis doing, a 7 seconds cover band. I mean, it was endless, the stuff that would happen there. And for a while, it was America's own rock and roll party town. There was nothing like that. And as much as certain festivals are, of course, incredible experiences if you're a giant music dork, when this stuff was going, there was literally nothing better than the experience of being at this event. It was crazy. I don't know if, as the years go on, as we hopefully inch past the COVID-19 pandemic, South by could become a thing like it was. It certainly seems like people are out there seeing shows, and certain things like some of our competitors, Brooklyn Vegan and Stereo Gum, have their South by Southwest parties and a bunch of, cool younger bands playing. Hopefully you can. I know for me and myself, it seems a little bit much with the cost of things right now. Feels like a little bit more than is worth it, but we'll see. I'd love to be there again, and it would be the kind of thing that I wish everyone could experience. So that's all for this week's episode of This Week is Live. Thank you so much for joining. I want to remind everyone, if you do not already, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Twitch. If you engage with our content anywhere that we post it, whether it's in YouTube Shorts, whether it's in Instagram, whether it's in Twitter, any place, Facebook, any place that we end up sharing these things, thanks so much for engaging with it. We're going to be here every week. We've got all kinds of surprises coming this year, and we'll be back each week with new episodes of this show roughly around 5:30. Obviously, today we are quite late in the prospectus. But once again, we hope you join us next week. So glad to see you well.